I got to it gradually, and by the time I read Orwell, Animal Farm, and 1984, I became quite aware, because it's explicit in those books. There's all this double speak, right? That language can be used for various purposes, but still, the framework in which all this happens didn't become clear to me till I got to reading Foucault and about power, and how language is an instrument of power, and what you are allowed to say and what you are not allowed to say. And the latter is sometimes much more important than the former. So I think when I put all those things together, then I realized that language is an instrument of power that exists in a particular structure, and it can be used to do various things against your will, or you can manipulate with language. So that was my journey to this conclusion.
Anjum, I learn something every time we do one of these things. So it's very nice. Very similar, in some ways, I think, despite different countries, perhaps different decades to an extent, but coming from the kind of background that I do, educated parents, comfortable kind of background, I was reading from an early age. My mother used to get me all kinds of books when I was a kid, and I must have read a lot, again, as Anjum did, before I remember reading. But and I certainly do remember reading Enid Blyton and many of those things. But when I read that question, the first book that actually popped into my mind was a very nice book that my aunt got me. I don't remember how old I was at the time. I was a kid, and the book was called When Daddy Was a Little Boy. That was the title of the book. And it was basically about a father telling, I think, his daughter or son, I've forgotten now, about his escapades when he was a boy, and what he used to do. And this is sort of a way of him telling her things, to do things, certain things, to not do other things, and what happened to me when I was a boy. And I still remember that book so clearly, because one of the episodes of that book was when Daddy gets addicted to table tennis, or ping pong, as he calls it in the book, and then that's all he can think of, and he just plays ping pong all the time. And then what happens to his studies, and things like that. So that is the first book that I really, I think, remember vividly. I still remember it. About the second part of the question, more than making meaning, what I thought of when I saw the question was how much these books, like Enid Blyton's book or other kinds of books, they created these worlds in my head that I just couldn't stop thinking about. And I would spend the day sort of wanting to get back into that world. So you go to school, you're doing other things, but you have that thing in your mind, okay, in the evening I'm going to read the book, and that's where I left off, and I want to kind of go back into that world and continue that. So that's what I remember a lot, the power of creating those worlds. Right? And of course, I can't, I'm not a writer in that sense. I'm not a creative writer, so I cannot create those worlds. But as a reader, I still love that. And I've long since stopped reading fiction, sadly, for various reasons that we need not go into. I've hardly read any fiction in years. But even with the non-fiction I read, that's what I find myself, that I love getting into those worlds, which are so different from where I am in physically. So yeah, but of course I definitely would second a lot of what Anjum said about language and its power, but all of that realization came very, very slowly to me.
Thank you so much, sir, for responding. Even I can relate with what you said, that books transport us to a different world, and we can't wait to go back to that world. So yeah, I really relate with that. And Harry Potter books were one of the first books that I even started my reading journey with. So that is great to hear. And I would like to move on to the next question, which is, Professor Anjum is from Pakistan and Professor Amit is from India. So how did the collaboration for this book happen?
It's the miracle of the internet, it brings people with shared interests together, and it doesn't respect any borders or any identities. So it can bring people together for shared interests that are good and also for shared interests that are bad. So it was just an accident.
Well, I can add a little more detail. So maybe even some of you who might want to end up doing something like this, it's all possible now. Both of us were in the US and we were part of this email list called Urdu List. This was before WhatsApp and many other kinds of things that we now know, or the kind of video calls and so forth. This was the mid of the first decade of the century. So mailing lists were common, of common interest. So we were both on Urdu List. And we found each other there asking some questions and so forth. And we realized this shared interest in many things, but particularly Ghalib at the time. And we decided to do, we both had blogs. So we decided to do a sort of common series of writing on Ghalib's couplets. And maybe a little bit later, we'll talk about why we chose what we chose, because I see that's one of your questions. So we ended up choosing a few of these shares and writing about it on our respective blogs. That's how we corresponded for the whole series that we did for a few years. And then we lost contact for many years after that, doing our own things. And it was during the pandemic that Anjum contacted me and said, why don't we turn this into a book? Pandemic was a kind of curious time. Of course, technology had progressed a lot. So we were actually able to see each other for the first time. During the pandemic when we did video calls. Until then, we hadn't seen each other. And even till now, we haven't met in person. Despite having known each other now for over a decade. So it's a kind of an interesting prospect, of doing these kinds of things together. Of course, we would love to meet sometime and, be with each other in person. But even if that doesn't happen, I think a lot of possibilities these days are there in this kind of technology. And we should really be using it a lot more, because it kind of goes to one of the last questions you have about the times we live in and the forces that drive us apart. These kinds of things are really important in bringing us together.
Thank you, sir. I see that the pandemic has, it was a tough time, but it has given us some good things, and the book is one of them. So I'm glad.
It's very kind of you.
The third question is there any Ghalib shade or nazm that you go back to in tough times? And which of Ghalib's philosophies have you adopted or held close to your heart?
For me, I go back to the couplet that Ghalib has written that he used to go back to when he was in a very despairing state, which is रात दिन गर्दिश में हैं सात आसमां हो रहेगा कुछ ना कुछ घबराएं क्या. So I think if he chose it, then it makes a lot of sense to me. As for which of his philosophies, I can mention two. The first, I have imbibed from Ghalib is that to have a set of principles and to be faithful to them. That to me is the most important lesson in life. And the second of his philosophies is the one of inclusiveness.
A lot of things that make life complex. And easy answers may not be forthcoming. Or in other words, you have to think a little bit, think for yourself and so on. I really like that aspect of his personality and his attitude while having fun. Because you can see that when he's writing, he's having fun. His mischievousness comes through so clearly in even the serious poetry. So how to be in this world, to do justice to its complexity, to be not afraid to think through problems, assume difficult positions, all the while having fun doing it, I think is a very nice skill to cultivate for all of us, and we can learn that from Ghalib.
Amit, is the difference in our choice, do you think it's a function of the difference in our ages? You still have the time to think of the alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's quite likely.
Thank you, sir. I agreed with what Amit sir said, that it's important to cultivate the skill to think and also to deal with the problems of the world, but also continue to have fun. So, yeah, I think that is important because life does not get easy and you have to somehow continue. So, I'll continue with the questions. The next question is, what are some of Ghalib's couplets that struck you as soon as you noticed them?
For me, they are the ones that we have put right at the beginning of the book. So, क्या फर्ज है कि सबको मिले एक सा जवाब, आओ ना हम भी सैर करें कोई तो की. That sets you off on a completely new trajectory. Once you absorb it, it's a very profound couplet. And then the next one, लाजिम नहीं कि खिज़र की हम पैरवी करें, जाना के एक बुजुर्ग हमें हम सफर मिले. I mean, how to live, how to think for yourself. For me, those are as soon as I read them, I knew this is something that carries a lot of meaning.
For me, it's the so one at the end, which I miss no occasion to recite it because I like it so much. Wafadari basharte ustuwari asle iman hai. It's a little difficult in terms of language, but it packs so much punch. Wafadari basharte ustuwari asle iman hai, mare butkhane mein to kabe mein gaado Brahman ko. That the essence of faith is to be faithful, to be firm in your beliefs. बशर्ते उस्तवारी, उस पे उस्तवार रहना, उस पे कायम रहना, उस पे अटल रहना, जिसमें हमारी आस्था है, जिसमें हमारा विश्वास है, उस पे अटल रहना, यही ईमान है, असल ईमान का यही है. और उसकी जो दलील है, I mean the first line is really okay. I mean it's just a kind of good Farsi line, right? I often like to point out that this is the kind of registers that Ghalib operates in. He writes lines which are practically Persian. In this first line, if you were to just replace hey with ast, it would be a perfectly legitimate Persian line. Everything else is in Persian. But the second line is so eminently Hindi in a way. Mare butkhane mein to kabe mein gaado Brahman ko. And that Gardna has made all the difference. It made it so earthly. तो उसकी दलील जो है ये है कि अगर कोई ब्राह्मण है, ब्राह्मण here is the symbol of a faithful Hindu, तो अगर वो मंदिर में मर गया, यानी मंदिर में वो रह के अपने भगवान के साथ रह के उसकी मौत हो गई है, तो he is worthy of being conferred the highest honor that anyone can get in Islam, which is to be buried in the Kaaba. Right? And I really love all that he has done with this. He's not the only one by any means who would do this, but when I first read this couplet, it really, really jumped out at me, and I've never forgotten it since then.
Thank you, sir. That was a really interesting couplet, and yeah. So, this is about the book. What inspired you to re-articulate Ghalib's poetry to explain and unveil contemporary issues of national and international politics, leadership, religion, governance, and so forth?
Really, the realization that we had an indigenous resource that could help us better understand and address all these issues that you have mentioned.
Yeah. There's the next question is, how has Ghalib's poetry tradition been received and interpreted in modern times? What are your views about it?
I feel that, Ghalib is appreciated as one of the great poets of the subcontinent of Urdu. But the appreciation has tended towards the aesthetic aspects of his poetry and have undervalued the intellectual aspects of it, the meanings that are contained within it. And I think that that's a serious loss. Because I mean there are different. Ghalib is writing quite different types of poetry. So there is the kind of poetry that is the classical poetry that comes from Mir and so that. But there is also this very deeply philosophical poetry, and I feel that we have ignored it, and that we should value it more highly.
Just one thought that occurred to me right now when Anjum said this. I agree with what he said. What perhaps happened, and I'm just sort of guessing here partly, is that some of this philosophical Ghalib, perhaps a lot of it, comes from Bedel. So he gets different things from different people, and of course he's getting a lot from Mir in the classical tradition. But a lot of his philosophy is highly influenced by Abdul Qadir Bedel, who wrote entirely in Persian. And people here may have heard of him, may not. He is considered to be one of the biggest poets of Persian from the subcontinent. He lived in the sort of the late Mughal period, roughly around Aurangzeb's time, so much before Ghalib. But he casts a big shadow on philosophical, metaphysical, and philosophical poetry in the subsequent years, particularly on Ghalib. And that because Bedel wrote in Persian, and that poetry is not accessible very much to us, particularly in India. In Pakistan, perhaps there's still some tradition of teaching Persian and reading Persian, but in India it's much less. That part of Ghalib, it's not that we can't read it or get something from it, but we don't get it all because we don't know its antecedents well enough and so forth. So we, of course, for our book, it doesn't matter so much because our concerns are not philosophical. Ours are primarily sociological, political, economic type of lessons that we want to take from there. But if you wanted to do this sort of serious thing with Ghalib, there is an impediment that we face that also needs to be contended with. And it goes back to kind of our loss, right? The various kinds of loss during the colonial period, one of which I referred to, which is this artificial creation of Hindi and Urdu as two different literary traditions when they never were. And the other is that we don't have access anymore to Persian in the way that we would need to be able to appreciate this poetry a little bit at a deeper level.
Amit, I think we should also add that one reason for the privileging of the aesthetic appreciation is the very form of Urdu poetry, which is the ghazal, which places a lot of the pleasure comes from anticipating, the rhyme and the meter, and because it has no continuity of thought, each couplet could be saying very different things. So, there isn't one central idea that is coming across to you, which is why in this book we have not stuck to the form of the ghazal. We have selected independent couplets that are very profound, rich in meaning, and then explicated them. So we have gotten away from all the, the attraction of the rhyme and the meter, which, because this is an oral tradition, the ghazals were recited in a mushaira, and people were excited about what's going to come next and what's the punchline here. So I think that's an important part.
Yes.
And also, let me add also that the appreciation, this side has become even more accentuated because these ghazals have been sung by, very celebrated singers. And people listen to them for entertainment and enjoyment. So I guess Sehgal and Jagjit Singh and Chitra and all those people have been singing Ghalib ghazals.
I completely agree with whatever Professor Anjum just said, that Ghalib's poetry and his meaning somewhere gets lost in the aesthetic appeal that his poems have. And This is one of my personal favorite questions. What made you choose Ghalib and his poetry? Why not other Urdu poets who share similar ideologies or Bhakti poets like Kabir?
Very simple, because Ghalib is non-didactic. Unlike almost all other poets who also raise questions, Ghalib doesn't give you the answer. He forces you to think for yourself. And as education, that is what we are trying to get our students away from. That, there is no answer that is already available. It's at the end of the book, or the poet has already told you, or you can find it on the internet. It's setting you off on a search, and that really distinguishes Ghalib. It makes him very different from almost every other poet. That's his appeal in this kind of an endeavor.
Just to add to that, I think people should do it with others. I hope somebody on this call will take up, will be inspired to write similar books. I think Thinking with Kabir is a great book to think about, right? And he said many thought-provoking things. I think you can have a whole series of Thinking with, right? And we have so many people in the subcontinent that have said remarkable things in just 2 lines or very few lines, that we need to do a lot of this work. And it's not that it's not that it hasn't been done necessarily so much as with every generation one needs to think of ways of doing it. It's because to take your example, Kabir, I mean, of course, people will remember so many things that he said all over India and Pakistan. I'm sure people sing him, people know what he has said. But with every generation, that mode of engagement has to rejuvenate itself. Otherwise, it just becomes sort of a quote-unquote tradition. And sometimes I really don't like this word because of what's happening with it. It's become sort of this invocation of हमारी तो वो परंपरा है, बस परंपरा है, उसको रखा हुआ है कहीं पे, अब उसके बारे में सोचना हमारा काम नहीं है, वो परंपरा हो गई. So that is what really is the problem. So rethinking, redoing it, और वो परंपरा को अगर जीवित नहीं रखोगे तो वो मर जाएगी. फिर उसमें कोई बात नहीं रहेगी जो किसी के काम की रहे. वो काम की इतनी है कि कोई भाषण में उसको कह सके कि हमारी भी एक कोई बड़ी बड़ी परंपरा हुआ करती थी. So for that, I think we need to do this work with many people. For every generation, it needs to be done in its own way.
On Kabir, Amit, may I mention Arvind Krishna's Malhotra's new version, which is cast in a very modern idiom, which is in today's language. It's worth reading, certainly worth reading.
Thank you so much, sir. There are a lot of great writers in our club as well who I hope are listening to this so that they can take this up in the future. And we'll continue with the questions. The next question is, what do you think is the relevance of the title Thinking with Ghalib, as Ghalib and modern generations are centuries apart? And what criteria did you use to select the particular couplets for your book?
Look, Plato and Aristotle are even further apart than Ghalib and the modern generation, and so is Milton, and people are still thinking with them. On the relationship, if it were my relation with my money lender, I would say, well, it would be better if I didn't have any relationship at all. But if the relationship is with something that you are passionate about, then of course you want a relationship, and you prefer that to having no relationship at all. Because if you have a relationship, you always have the opportunity to repair whatever is hurting that relationship. And if you are passionate, then without that relationship, you can live, but some part of you dies. And sometimes you don't want it to die.
And this is particularly the case for relationships across India and Pakistan, because if you, one of the kind of attempts at political control is to precisely have sever these relationships. As long as there are even problematic relationships, as long as there is some kind of a conversation going, there's a scope for something, right, to emerge out of it and so on. But when you really cut it off, then misunderstandings, lack of understanding, just moving completely separate ways becomes very easy to do. The evolution that sort of takes over, and soon there is very little left to talk to each other about. So in that sense, I would take this couplet that, even if we are fighting, and by fighting, of course, I don't mean the kind of bullets and bombs kind of fighting, but fighting of disagreement. As long as we are fighting, we are talking. And when we have stopped it, and this is of course true for personal relationships too, that the end of the relationship is when you've just retreated into your own thing, and there's no dialogue anymore at that point. There's not even any way that misunderstandings can be removed, right? That's the sense in which I would take this couplet.
There is nothing that will make me sever my relationship with India, no matter what happens. And one can keep it alive in small ways. I'm wearing a kurta from Fab India in Delhi. That's my way of saying my relationship is still there.
Thank you, sir. That's really beautiful. We have one question for the young and restless generation. You have discussed Sufism in your book. So, what lessons from Ghalib and Sufism as a whole can benefit this young and restless generation, especially when sectarianism, communalism, intolerance, and the gap between the rich and the poor are on the rise? The states don't want to be questioned, and there is an overall rightward shift in the politics around the world.
I'm not an expert in Sufism, but I think the two lessons that are part of the couplets that we have chosen. One is the importance of the journey from being a mortal to being a human being. The journey from being an Admi to an Insan. It's the Sufi journey. And that, I think, is important. And the other is this sense of the unity of the entire, whatever exists. It's unity of purpose, it's unity of identity. I think it's the last couplet in the book. Millatein jab mit gayi, ajzaye ima ho gayi. That we are all one, and that's a powerful lesson that Ghalib has taken from Sufi thought. I'm sure it's in Hindu thought as well. Amit might elaborate on that, but that thought is what I think that we should pay heed to.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a very big question and not worthy of a whole talk or a session in itself. And of course, I'm also not an expert. But you have to stop and ask yourself, why is there so much love poetry in the world? Why are people obsessed with this? In every age, apparently people just don't get tired of saying this, right? And it's been said 1,000 times and 10,000 times and so on, right? Although it's been said many times, many ways, kind of thing. But apparently you still feel the need to say this. And this goes back to the other force, which is what you mentioned are just the contemporary manifestations of forces that keep us apart and prevent us from loving each other. But every age has those forces. There is no age that doesn't. That's part of being human. So this message here of Ghalib and of many people, including Kabir that we've spoken about and others too, is that you have to hold on to that. In every age, it has to be renewed, right? And people have to be reminded of it. And that is the way that we survive as human society, because if it was not there, then we would tear ourselves apart. We would have torn ourselves apart a long time ago. bears repetition in every age, right? I don't know how many of you remember this old Amitabh Bachchan movie Zanjeer. In that, there's a song called Yari Hai Iman Mera. There's a beautiful line in that, which I was reminded of when Anjum was talking. प्यार हो बंदों से ये सबसे बड़ी है बंदगी. So this is the kind of message that if you are bandagi, your whatever it is that you worship, and this ideology need not be a religious ideology. We have plenty of 20th century ideologies which are not religious, but which consider themselves above people. So once you've got that, whatever political, religious ideology it is, you are down the path to destruction. And what all these guys are doing is bringing us back to earth and saying, if you've forgotten how to relate to your fellow human beings, then really there's not much else that is there in the world that is worth doing. Right? Pothi pad pad jag mua, Pandit Bhayanak ko hai.
Thank you so much, sir. We have one last question for you. What was the publishing experience like, and how does it feel to see people reading and loving your book?
We had a fairly smooth publishing experience. We really didn't have much problem finding a publisher in both the countries. And the experience, it's a very humbling one. You know, it's I still feel overawed by this thought that people are reading the book and liking it. What else can I say?
It's very nice, and especially if it's college students and so on reading it. It's really wonderful. I mean, that's the whole reason for doing it. So I'm really glad that you reached out and we did this session. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much, sir.
There anymore, like an artificial intelligence could write like Ghalib.
I would question the originality part of it, because GPT would just look at everything that is already written and compile something out of that. It would not be able to come up with a new idea in the sense in which Ghalib came up with such incredibly novel ideas. I sincerely doubt that.
Another very nice question, Radhika. I mean, it really makes you think. And this is actually a good tradition to ask this question in, because this tradition is so much about actually reading other people and thinking of ways of doing what they have done in a different way. So a mediocre or a bad poet of this tradition is basically doing what ChatGPT does, which is read a whole bunch of stuff and then just write something that sounds like that. It's actually, and there's a lot of poetry that is like that. It doesn't have that X factor which Ghalib will have, and that's the difference I think that Anjum is referring to. So when Ghalib says आते हैं गैब से ये मज़ामी ख्याल में, Ghalib सरीर खामा नवाए सरोश है. What is this नवाए सरोश, this breath of the angel? ये जो मज़ामीन ख्याल में आ रहे हैं, ये जो थीम्स ख्याल में आ रहे हैं, वो गैब से आ रहे हैं, कहीं और से आ रहे हैं, इस दुनिया से नहीं आ रहे हैं. और मैं जो लिख रहा हूँ, ये जो स्क्रिबलिंग है मेरे कलम की, that is like the whispering of an angel. Now that angel, that figure there is that X factor, which you can't get by just reading every single poet that is out there and then writing something in that language. That's what ChatGPT does. Now, that can produce perfectly good poetry, I think. It's not like it's going to be necessarily bad poetry, but it's not going to be that kind of thing, which you will get from a human being. I mean, at least we'd like to believe so. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe you just need to wait long enough.
He still cannot put the heart in it.
That's what we would like to think. Yeah. I mean, yeah, but who knows? I feel a little, technology, I don't know.
I think I'm going to try it after the session. Ask ChatGPT to write We have Vandana. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi. So just continuing with what we were just discussing about ChatGPT and writing poetry. I don't know. I agree with, I think, Amit sir in a way, um, because we don't really know. And this debate about AI and, original, authentic art has been here for a really, really long time. Right, and even today, when we have like animated movies that get to platforms like Netflix, and then we get this debate about how this inspired art, like which is made by real human beings, and then they use this art without giving credit to the real source of inspiration. I don't remember that movie, and it recently brought out this debate on this whole thing about because there's this Netflix documentary, I think, or a movie which used art of real artists from various sources on internet, and then they didn't give any credit to the people.
Interesting.
So I think it like very much remains, and then this whole debate then again about what is real and what is not, because then everything is actually inspired. So we really don't know, and I think we'll figure it out in a way, because today we have people who appreciate digital art, and we can't call it that it's not art. So again, I feel that we are entering into a very different world in a way. Also, I have to ask something to our speakers. So I have a friend, and he wanted to ask that is there any way he can like contact you guys via email or Instagram, like if were to like write a feedback or something. So is it possible?
Yeah, sure.
Like, do you guys have an email or something like which you guys are comfortable with sharing for your readers? I don't know.
Yeah, Anjum, for me, no problem. Kartikeya has, or Shreya has my email. So please feel free to share it, no problem.
Okay,
Yes,
and
please share it. We would love to be in touch. We would love to engage. That's why we've written the book. So nothing would be better than that.
that would be great. Thank you so much.
For those who want to send feedbacks, we'll share the email after the session ends. And
Hello, good evening, sir. So, picking from Radhika's question, I had this very different kind of question in mind. Is that if you were to help, maybe let me frame it differently. If Ghalib was to be with us here in today's time, what is one concept or one thing which has evolved in our world over the past 200 years that you would like to introduce to him?
It's an interesting one.
Tough question. Tough question.
You mean apart from all the profusion of liquors and wines, I believe, of which you'll be very happy to be introduced, but I guess we can't limit ourselves to that. Anjum, what do you think? I mean, I wonder how, this kind of raises the question of contemporary political forms, for example, whether one talks about the constitution or various forms of the republic in the modern sense and so forth. Part of me wants to say that, the aristocratic Ghalib, of course, would be horrified at the thought of the hoi polloi running society. That seems to be the standard kind of thing to, but maybe he would surprise you. Maybe he would say, this is fantastic. I'm really happy that, we've done away with this whole weird system of people making decisions just because their fathers made decisions or whatever it is. And we are thinking of something different. I don't know. What do you think would be his reaction to this kind of modern society?
I think Amit, that Ghalib anticipated so many things about our modern society that his contemporaries didn't have the vaguest clue. I mean, look, he was living in monarchical times, and when you read this couplet "Chalta hu thodi dur har ek tez raw ke saath," it fits so much into our electoral way of governance, where we are electing new people every 5 years or so. I really don't think, that too much would surprise him. Of course, there'd be factual things like the division of India, for example, that he might have some anything cynical to say about, which would be new for him. So we could ask him, how can people commit this kind of madness? Do you have an explanation for this?
And that makes me think that if you want to give him an Urdu writer to read after his time, maybe you can give him Manto.
Yeah.
They seem to be similar spirits.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Riddhi, you have raised your hand. Please go ahead with the question.
Yeah, hello, sir. So my question is that Ghalib started writing when he was very young. He was around 11 years old. And I mean, he got married when he was 13. So how, like, does his poetry is reflective of his age when he was writing, like how he was young? And yeah, that.
I think people have tried to do a chronology saying, this was the young Ghalib and this is the more mature Ghalib. But even the young Ghalib is so incredibly mature and profound that, one has to reflect on what kind of education these people at that time must have been receiving, that they had such a rich understanding of life that they could then communicate via poetry. I think it's more a reflection on the systems of education and how they have deteriorated. I'm sure that there were other people at that time who were more or less doing the same thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. This reminds me of those who can understand Urdu. You can check out this lectures that Ustad Ahmed Javed, who's in Lahore, I think he's based in Lahore, does. One of his recent lectures, I remember it now because the title is Poetry of a 15-year-old Boy. That's the title of the lecture on YouTube, and it's actually one of Ghalib's verses written when he was 15. It's an analysis of that verse. So you can look at that to kind of see what Anjum is saying. What he was talking about at that age was also very profound. So it's a kind of a different person. I mean, his brain works differently. Obviously, he is an outlier in some ways. There would be others. But there's a question also on the chat about whether we think there's another one. And the thing, of course, with this is that you can never really tell until years have passed, right? Some things have to age to know if it's actually that profound. But I don't know enough of contemporary poetry to say if there's anybody like him. But yeah.
There's a question in the chat box by Chaitanya. Do you think that there can ever be another Ghalib, or do you see any poet trying to step up that pedestal?
I hope there is, but it's been God 500-600 years. There hasn't been another Shakespeare. So I mean, these are rare individuals.
Yeah, and I don't know that you want necessarily another one. I mean, you've got one. I think that's good enough. You might want some other people, like maybe different kinds of things, right? But I think it's also worth thinking about this in context of the ChatGPT question, because if it is true that technology does, what automation does is basically replaces human labor wherever it's wherever it's possible, and if human artistic or creative labor is replaced by machines to an extent, then one of two things, either you end with hardly any humans then being able to do this and it being taken over by a mechanical process, or more optimistically, you really select for those humans who can do much better than machines. So it takes away the jobs of a lot of mediocre poets and artists and so on who have no hope of competing with a machine in terms of how fast it can produce these things. But if you happen to be that human who can do better than the machine, then your labor is going to be in great demand. right? And I guess it remains to be seen which of the two comes to pass.
Thank you, sir. There's another question by Soumya. Ghalib has used different forms of poetry to write, like ghazal, nazm, etc. What do you think about which form is more apt to deliver the flow of ideas?
I haven't actually ever come across a nazm by Ghalib. Ghalib has written most of his, the best known work of his is in ghazals, and ghazal doesn't have a continuity of thought. So you have to pick the individual couplets. And then there are, a lot of rubais and qatas and Ghalib and some very famous masnavis. And for students, if I were to pick one and recommend one, it would be Chirag-e-Dair, which Ghalib wrote when on the way to Calcutta he stopped in Banaras. It is certainly worth reading. It takes you into the mind of that man and his worldview, his secular perspective that he has expressed beautifully in that masnavi. So, and there you have that continuity of thought. He is expressing certain ideas about love and people and respect and unity. It's worth reading.
And there's a new English translation out also.
Yes. By
Thank
Maz Bilal.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Vidhi, please go ahead.
It's not a comment on the session. So I loved this session today. First of all, it was very informative, and I loved how the friendship that has formed between both the professors here, and even though they have never met, they have written such a good book, and it kind of it kind of gives me hope in cross border and cross cultural friendships, because even though we might never meet the other person, there's still so many things that can be expected out of the friendship and can be proven of it, and that the result can be such a good book and even more endeavors. So really like that, and thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to listen to you.
Of course. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. That's our hope too. I think we are living in difficult times, but there are always cracks and fault lines in the system that we can exploit. And technology has provided one, and we should really use it.
If anyone has any comments or feedbacks, you can drop a message in the comment section. I would like to ask both the professors about how they liked the session and if they have any thoughts.
Well, I'm immensely impressed. This is a student-run initiative. You have thought about it. You have contacted the authors. People have read the book. They have very interesting questions. So that in itself is a sign of hope in these difficult times. People are still reading. People are still thinking. In that sense, they are following in the footsteps of Ghalib. And what more could one ask for?
बिल्कुल बहुत अच्छा लगा. I second everything Anjum says. The student-led effort and the questions were wonderful. बहुत ही बढ़िया. So I'd love to be, connected to you and maybe back sometime.
Thank you for giving us your time, for being so patient and answering all the questions in depth. And we are really glad to have you here today for this session. And we hope the members also enjoyed the session as much as I did. And we hope to have you in the future for one of our sessions. And hopefully, if we get very lucky, to have you both in person in our college in an offline event. Thank you so much.
Inshallah, that would be wonderful.
You had one of the questions that you didn't get to ask was, what else we would want to write or have written. So I should mention that I have written 2 books on Faiz, and Faiz is also a very popular poet. So both of them were published in Delhi by Akar Books. So you can look them up, and maybe we can have a session on Faiz.
Okay, sir. Sure. We'll share the information about the book with our members, and hopefully we can have one session again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.